considered a republic. Benjamin Franklin called our country that they justifies with Constitution a republic. Madam, if you can keep it. So what did he mean by republic? What is your understanding of the definition of a republic? Victoria, what do you think? Uh-huh. Thanks.
Representative government?
It's a representative government. Oh, I think you looked it up.
No.
Okay. Oh, very good. So, representative government. Right. Because there's just too many of us to have a democracy in that we're voting on every single policy. We have to have these intermediaries who represent our interests to go make policy on our behalf. Okay, good. Thank you. So, because we do have a republic, a representative government, we are electing representatives. So there's got to be some kind of connection between people, citizens, and their representatives, right? Somehow, those representatives who are representing us in our republic have got to understand our preferences and what we want them to do to some extent, right? Now, when they get to the legislature or wherever they're serving, they're going to have insider information that we as the public don't have. So you have some scholars and philosophers who say, well, actually legislators should represent the entire interest, the interest of the country rather than their particular district. And that's an argument that we have. You know, how much should they take into consideration their voters versus the good of the general community, the general welfare. But be that as it may, what we are going to be talking about for the next few weeks are linkage institutions that link people to the governments that surround them. So an institution, for me in my mind, I think institution, I see like the state capitol or the Supreme Court. Something like that in my mind. I'm seeing a physical building, you know, that is going to last for a while, that is structured, that has certain rules and procedures that it follows, and that the people working there adhere to those rules and regulations, etc. Right? That's an institution. Now, the institution, though, can be conceptual. It doesn't have to be a building. Right? It's just a process. It's a structure of how we interact with those representatives who are promoting our interest and the general interest in government. So today we're going to talk about one of those linkage institutions is elections and voting. So elections is a very real way that we are linked to our representatives, right? Because we vote for them. They are in their office because we elect them. And theoretically and hopefully and realistically, we hold them accountable. If they're not doing what we want, then we vote for somebody else, is the thinking. So they represent our interest. Okay, so elections and voting link us in that way. All right, let's talk about elections. All right, I wanted to introduce elections in particular by looking at the contemporary issues in Texas with elections and voting. And I'm sorry, I don't make a big distinction between the two, elections and voting. I think they're kind of matched up. Just so you're aware. I want you to see this document. Just going to make it a little bit bigger. All right. So there was legislation in 1993 passed by Congress, signed by President Clinton, sometimes called the Motor Voter Law. They were trying to make it easier for citizens to register to vote. So in this federal legislation, they required states to enable people to register to vote when they got their driver's license. Maybe you noticed that first time you got your driver's license, or when you renew it, you can also register to vote. All right, good. That was to make it easier. So political scientists studied what happened, what was registration like after that National Voter Registration Act of 1993. So you can see this scientist was studying New Hampshire and Oregon, so they are colored. The United States percentage is there in the median, so that's a percentage, like an average, right? So if you look at these presidential election years, can you see where Texas is regarding voter turnout, basically?
Last.
Yeah, we're last. Yes.
We're not even 50, we're 51.
No, we're 51, 2020. I want to make sure that was 2020. Yep.
That's good.
Year by year. Texas, Texas, Texas.
Do you think it's because, like, there's so many people and there's such a large, like, geography? Like, I'm just thinking people in West Texas. They might have to drive an hour to the polling stations. They're not going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Good point. And
lines
our
are
absentee
long.
ballots require you to have a certain reason why you're going to use that, right? You're
Right.
eligible and just living too far from the polls. That's really not one of them.
Right.
That's a really good point. You know, I guess California, I was thinking, well, California has a huge population too, so they're kind of
Yeah.
down here as well. So, yeah. So that's a really good observation. It could be just because of the numbers. And yeah. You wonder. Texas is lower than California.
But it's just kind of shocking. I feel like Texas is a very, like, I feel like a lot of people in Texas talk politics. You know what I mean?
I do.
I mean, maybe I don't know because I'm not in other states, but I just feel like it's a common topic in Texas.
I agree. So it's interesting to see this, isn't it? This data. So it's turnout, and this is prior to the National Voter Registration Act. Let's see, was Texas any better then?
47.
Oh, 42? Yeah. So kind of the same before and after. The National Voter Registration Act kind of went down a little bit too after that. All right, so that is an issue. No voter turnout, which is affected by our political culture. You're right, we have these wide open spaces. And we've had recently closures of polling locations. We used to have more that were spread out, but we have fewer now. And that could be a factor in that as well. But you noticed over time, though, still we were low. So I don't know how much of a factor that is. But I think political culture as well. Think about those two political culture themes that we've discussed since the beginning of the semester. Do you remember the two that we talked about?
Western individualism.
Western individualism.
Southern traditionalism.
And Southern traditionalism, very good. And both of those are a little bit reticent about being really involved in government and seeing government as a way to meet needs and to address problems. There's kind of, when those are combined, it's like, let's do it at a local level, let's go through religious institutions or community organizations to provide these services rather than government. Right? So that would diminish turnout, right? People aren't seeing government as an answer to the question. On the other hand, though, in this conceptualization, California is one of those governments that are moral. That's their theme in their state, where government can address problems. And we see a lot more regulations coming out of California, and yet, as we just compared, they're still low down on the turnout. So that's not sufficient. Maybe it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to explain that. Voter ID law. Having to show a photo ID to go vote. You can't use your student ID.
I thought you could. Okay. I mean, I just showed on my driver's license.
Yeah, right. But you have to have a driver's license.
Or an ID. Or
an ID. Yeah, there's various forms to show. But if you had to go get a form in order to vote, you had to go pay for it, would you? You know? No, I just ran into, when my mother stopped driving, her driver's license expired, and in order to vote, had to get her, and she was in a wheelchair, so I had to take her to the Department of Motor Vehicles and, pay and get her picture made so she could vote still. And that was a lot.
Yeah.
to get that done. And if she didn't have help, I don't know how she would have done it. So that's a consideration. Yeah.
Are you able to go vote with passport?
Yes. That's one of the.
But not a lot of people have passports.
But not a lot of people have passports.
And it takes a long time to get a passport.
Yes.
And they're
Yeah.
more expensive than a driver's
Yeah.
license.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, even like my mother's ID card was $16. It's not that
Yeah.
much, really,
Yeah.
but then for some people it might be, So that's another one of those probably necessary but insufficient factors. A fewer polling locations, as I just mentioned. We're going to talk about Shelby County v. Holder. You read about it in the chapter, if you recall. Shelby County v. Holder in 2013 is when the federal government stopped pre-clearance requirements for our election laws. And we'll talk more about that then. So when the federal government stopped having to check off our elections policies, then we closed a bunch of polling locations. So that could be part of it too. Like you were saying, distances to go. So mail-in ballot, any of y'all using the mail-in ballot to vote while you're here? No? Okay. I just wanted to show you the website. If you did use it, first of all, let's see, what are the eligibility requirements? In order to even apply to vote by mail, you have to be eligible, which is 65 years or older, sick or disabled, expected to give birth within 3 weeks of election day, out of the county on election day, and during the period for early voting, which would apply to you guys. You could do that, or people serving in the military or away from their home districts. Confined in jail, but otherwise eligible. If you've been convicted of a felony, you're ineligible to vote until you have served your sentence. So you have to meet one of those criteria in order to apply for a mail-in ballot. So you have to submit the application to the county registrar where you vote. So anyway, there's a lot of verbiage telling you how to go through this process. But you have to submit it through the mail. Yeah.
So, I just kind of have a question.
Uh-huh.
So if you're voting, like early voting, whatever, and say my driver license says Lincolnville, because that's where I'm from,
Right.
and there's a poll place at Lincolnville,
Mhm.
do I have to go vote at Lincolnville or just within the county?
I think, that's a good question.
I went to early voting. I'm from Amarillo, and I'm registered in like Randall County, which is in Amarillo. And I went to early voting here, and they were able to. I could just vote here. They just like changed. They like when I was there, they changed it, and it was all a limited ballot, so it wasn't like everything, but like the main stuff. So it was like 5 or 6 people. Like you can still go. You can just go and vote, and they'll let you. If you do it during early voting, I think. I don't know how regular would work, but
Right.
yeah.
Because like
That's really
Lincolnville's in the county.
Yes,
But
exactly.
Since my ID.
You can vote anywhere within your own county.
Yeah.
Within-
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So you don't have a Lincolnville election going on, right? I guess when we saw that you were at the county website.
Yeah, Lincolnville actually does have a poll. It's at their high school.
Right, but are they electing anybody in Lincolnville? So that would be my only hesitation. But I don't know if, I don't know. I guess, yeah, the precinct numbers, whatever precinct you're in, that'd be, yeah, that's a good
At least
question.
it's not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it should. Since voting is done on a county level. So, but it is a process, you guys. You have to fill out, there's an application to have an absentee ballot. You fill that in, a lot of words, mail it in, and then you wait to get your absentee ballot mailed to you, and then you have to mail it back and, submit the correct information. So it's a process. Right, and so the eligibility, there's certain groups of people who are eligible, but not everybody. Requirements. What happened is in 2021, the legislature passed a law that made it more challenging to vote by absentee, in that you can use your driver's license, an ID number, or the last 4 digits of your social security as identifying number for you, but it had to be the same. So on that application that you sent in to get your absentee ballot, and then they sent you the ballot, and you have to send back the ballot, you had to use the exact same numbers. So if you forgot, oh, did I use my driver's license or the last four of my social, people were forgetting and their ballots being thrown away. So the requirements changed. So that was 2021, and then 2023, they had some pushback on that. So the legislature said, if people give the wrong numbers, we're going to give them a chance to fix it. We're going to contact them so they can fix it. So it's just, you've got to keep up with all this stuff, though, right? In order to be aware, in order to have your vote counted. Of course, we have campaign finance issues we talked about. In your book, it calls Texas the Wild West of campaign finance, because we are basically, except for those judicial elections that have some limitations on them. So it gives an impression of, just money being involved a lot in our elections and people spending a lot of money to get certain people elected. That's an issue too. Now, voter fraud is something we talk a lot about.
Especially in Texas.
Especially Texas, yes. Here, the Heritage Foundation, which leans conservative, they publish instances of successful prosecution of voter fraud. So I think it's really interesting to see, what are they prosecuting and how many cases do they have. So if you filter out to all the other states but Texas, you can see that there's a limited number of voter fraud cases going on. However, if you go and click on these little down arrows, you can see what they're about. And it's not just one person trying to vote fraudulently. Sometimes it is. But most of these are about people trying to coerce people to vote for them, giving them money in order to vote a certain way. So it's not just one vote represented by these people, it's a clump of votes that they found were fraudulent. I looked through them, and most of them are local elections. The county commissioner, 2 of them was from a county commissioner. There's a water board, a special district. And so it wasn't like these major elections that you hear about often. It's mostly at the local level when they're trying to get people to vote for them. It's still going on. It's part of history. It's been going on a long time. But I just think it's interesting. There's data that you can see about voter fraud and look at that. So that's a problem too. Issues that we're facing for elections and voting in our state. And so some general themes about elections and voting over time in the state of Texas. Our political culture creates barriers to voting. And we'll be talking about that in our lectures. This is something that I like to think about a lot. It is a compelling statement. Texas election systems are designed to produce certain types of outcomes. That's a challenging statement, I think. And it's not original to me. So I like to include it, though, because it really makes me ponder. Huh.
Makes you think.
Does it? And how? And who are the populations? It's just all these questions arise. So I think it's a theme that you can think about as we look through the information. Inclusion of minorities and women in Texas occurred mostly through actions of the federal government. The federal government forcing that, or opening up the opportunities, I should say. However, there are exceptions. So, as you know, African American citizens in Texas had very clear limits during Jim Crow and segregation and white primaries and these other things we're going to talk about. Hispanic populations were somewhere in between. So sometimes they were lumped in with African American populations, sometimes with white. It just depended. And sometimes it depended on which politician was running for office and how many votes they needed to win. So have you heard of political machines that existed in Boston and Chicago, New York, New Jersey? Do y'all know what that is?
Heard of them, I'm not quite sure what they are.
You have?
Oh, it was like, I remember learning this. Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I can remember it from U.S. government.
Okay, good. So you have like the chair of the Democratic Party.
Yeah. And then they were, yes, oh my gosh, it's coming back to me now.
Good. And then you have, like in Chicago, you had the Democratic chair, who was also the mayor of Chicago. And then you have wards, which are like the precincts.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have ward captains that report to the mayor. And they're making sure that people who are on the mayor's side are getting elected. How they do that is they go into the neighborhoods and say, you know, this person would really help you. And I think, you know, your job, your employer would be really happy if this person won.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't that be a good idea to vote for this person? You know, they would do that. Or do you like the house you're living in? Do you want to stay there? Yeah, well, maybe it depends on who wins this election. You know, they just really strong-arm people and to get them to vote for the person they want them to vote for. And this has happened. Well, you know, I thought we were so lily white in Texas. No, that couldn't happen to us. We're not Chicago. Oh, yes, we did. Down in the valley, that area, where they had party bosses that were wrangling Hispanic votes down there and getting them to vote and paying them $1 or something to vote for a certain candidate. Back before the progressive reforms in the early 1900s, it was easier to tell who was voting for who because at that time voting was done by script, by a piece of paper, and sometimes, you know, a different colored piece of paper. So you would take the script of the color of the party you were going to vote for and put it in the barrel, and so everybody could see who you were voting for. And if you voted with the right color, then you go get a beer afterwards. And they had the keg there. If not, then you might lose your job. So it was, yeah, it wasn't privacy in who you voted for until the early 1900s. So we had Hispanic participation, but I put a question mark because how much of it was autonomous participation and how much was coerced. Women, you know what? We were the first Southern state to ratify the 19th Amendment, give women the right to vote. So we've got to be proud of that. So we were voting in Texas primaries before the 19th Amendment. Congress and federal courts have an increasing role in our elections. You remember that Venn diagram we looked at a few weeks ago? Elections was one of those.
Sorry, I know you just said the last blank, but I was writing.
Courts, court decisions.
Courts, okay.
Yeah, federal courts. The federal courts are interpreting federal law, the federal Constitution, and remember Article 6 of our U.S. Constitution. They're supreme, so we gotta follow. All right, so kind of getting into the meat of the lecture now. This is an image near Texas Southern University in Houston. This is 2020 primary election. You can see the lines standing outside the poll to vote there in Harris County. They were having some massive problems. Now the primaries take place in second Tuesday in March here in Texas. And so they're voting within one political party. So when you go to the primaries, you have to choose which party you're going to vote in, their primary. So they're standing in line, and in Houston, these people, some of them waited in line for 6 hours after the polls closed at 7 p.m. I mean, it took them till after midnight to vote in the primary election.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it was crazy. It was mismanagement of the election, and then electronic voting machines, which we're required to have now since after the 2000 election, they were malfunctioning. So we want to make sure votes are being counted, so people had to wait. It was just horrible. So Harris County is an anomaly, as we've already talked about, some of their election decisions. In the 87th Texas Legislature, the second special session, of course that was in 2021, they increased early voting hours in smaller counties. So the state government pays counties for most of their election expenses. So smaller counties, they don't have a lot of money, because it's based on property taxes, the revenue that they get. So smaller counties are not going to have as much money, so they were required to increase those early voting hours to give people a chance to vote, especially in the smaller counties. But if you recall, we talked about this before. This is in 2021, overnight voting hours prohibited. Where were they doing overnight voting hours?
Heard.
Looked at local government, that was my first example. The drive-through, oh, this is drive-through voting. Drive-through voting in 24
Harris
hours.
County, right?
Harris County, yeah. Yep. Also, they had the vote by mail rule changes, which we talked about, with the identification numbers having to be the same. There's just two numbers on there. Made it a little bit stricter, and then also it increased the penalties for fraudulently voting by mail. To now it's a state jail felony, which could give you 2 years of prison or a fine of $10,000. So they increased that for fraudulent voting. Also, for the poll workers, people working the polls, if they did something fraudulent, they would also have that felony conviction rather than a misdemeanor, which is what it was before. Uh-huh.
How exactly do you vote fraudulently?
Well, maybe if you're an election worker, you make, I don't know, you do something.
Change
with
it? Yeah.
You change it, yes.
See that one, that
Yeah.
one. Is there any other ways to do that?
You could
Could
create
you
fake
go and,
identities and go vote multiple times.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
That's weird, don't do that.
Yeah.
Isn't it fraud if you vote in the wrong county?
Yes, right. So one poor soul voted in the wrong precinct. And
What if it's
yeah,
like
the
by
law-
accident?
What if
By
you didn't know?
accident.
Yeah.
I know, I know.
That would suck.
Yeah,
I'm just
yeah.
talking about.
And who knows what, did the poll worker hand her the wrong ballot? You know, I don't know
That would
details
be
of
me,
that.
oh God.
Yeah.
I would do that.
Yeah. So it's a little bit more intense, you could say, and the penalties have heightened. So we've got to be really careful what they're doing. And they also expanded poll watchers movement, so they have the right to watch the process of voting, to be close enough to watch, making sure the process is being followed. So that was a little bit intimidating to some of the poll workers, not knowing, okay, where are the poll watchers supposed to stand? So that clarified that. And crime for local election officials proactively distribute mail-in ballot applications, which some counties were trying to do this year, which I thought that was interesting. This is already passed in 2021, they still were thinking about it. Okay, in the most recent legislative session, they passed more elections bills. So they increased our early voting hours and expanded the days. So now 17 to 4 days before the election, 2.5 weeks, lots of time to vote. Increased penalty for illegal voting, that's that state jail sentence. Voters who submit mail-in ballot with error now will be notified, that's what I mentioned before, and have the opportunity to correct it. And then the Harris County Elections Administrator position was abolished. So y'all remember in 2020, the Harris County Elections official did the 24-hour voting and the drive-through voting. So they stopped that, but they also had the terrible lines there for the primary voters. And they did better, but then they still had people waiting at the polls for hours after they closed in order to vote later on.
How did they have like all this like drive-by overnight hours and they still had long lines?
Exactly.
Like what is going on?
Yeah. Yes. So the Harris County position is abolished, and now oversight is given to the Secretary of State, who is chief of our elections, or to oversee what's going on there. So that's kind of where our policy is at the moment. Elections and voting is an example of federalism in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 4. The times, places, and manners of holding elections for senators and representatives there in the state and the U.S. government shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations.
What was the thing?
Times, comma, places, comma, and manner. So the times, when the poll's going to be open, what hours, places, where the poll's going to be located, and manner. You need registration. Do you need voter ID? So, who's responsible for making those decisions according to the U.S. Constitution? States. Good. State legislatures are. However, they put a little caveat in there. Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. Just to let you know, states, we can come in if we need to. Okay. An example of this. So we have a federal system, right? States have authority to determine the times, places, and manners of election, but Congress can step in. So, wanted to look at suffrage, the legal right to vote in Texas elections. It's the legal right to vote in the United States and in Texas. So I'm going to start out when the U.S. was first established with our Constitution. The only people who were allowed to vote were white men with property. White men with property would pay taxes based on that property. So they felt like because your property could be taken away by tax payments, you should have the right to vote. Also, it is an indication, if you remember, of Shays' Rebellion. The people who had authority and power at this time were mostly wealthy individuals who were active in their state governments, and they were a bit nervous about the regular population, just the general population, because they had stopped government in Massachusetts. And so a little bit distrustful of what just the everyday people would do. So they limited it to white men with property. In the 1830s, with Jacksonian democracy, they expanded voting to all men. You recall Jackson, when he was president, was appointing friends to any old government office. You know, he said, anybody can do this. Just opened up government to people without wealth necessarily, but largely his supporters, if you remember that. Okay, so here in Texas, as we won our independence in 1836, and we had elections, sometimes they include Hispanic men when it was advantageous to count their votes. Then they would be counted. But by and large, it was as white men had suffrage. Y'all know this one? During Reconstruction, there were restrictions on voting. Remember what kind of oath they had to take?
Ironclad.
Yes, also an ironclad oath. Required to vote or run for office, and you had to state that you had never supported the Confederacy. So that limited the amount of people who could run in our elections, and it also made Republican Party candidates win, which was kind of unusual at that time. Right. So after the Civil War, we're going through Reconstruction. The federal government said that states had to ratify 3 Civil War amendments in order to rejoin the Union. I think it's so Texan. So we waited until these amendments had already been ratified, that we've had the 3/4 of the states ratify it
before we agreed. We waited to officially ratify them. So 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting slavery. 1868 was the 14th Amendment. We talked about this before, which includes the privileges and immunities of citizens, but also no state shall deny due process or equal protection of the laws. It's also in there. The due process, equal protection. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, which gave men the right to vote, no matter what race, shall not be denied on account of race. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The state of Texas had to ratify these, as I said, to enter the Union. So they did eventually. But they also tried to work around. So that's the next slide. So the 13th Amendment was 1865. If you recall, in 1866, we had a Constitution. The 1866 Constitution was written when people had to take the presidential oath, saying they would support the Constitution from now on. That was before the ironclad oath, right? So we had a lot of the people who were formally in power in the state, who were in charge of writing that 1866 Constitution. And in the 1866 Constitution, they included black codes. And black codes were laws that were very limiting on formerly enslaved people. African Americans without jobs, and just think about it, if you had been a slave and then you were freed, you probably didn't have jobs. So African Americans without jobs were often assigned to white guardians to work without pay. And if they left that employment, they could be imprisoned for breach of contract. There were fines against African Americans for violating curfews, possessing firearms, or objectionable public behavior. African Americans were not allowed to testify against whites, serve on juries, or in state militias, or to vote. So this was all in the 1866 Constitution. However, they never were enforced because in 1865, if you remember, Reconstruction was starting. So once Reconstruction got started here, they did not enforce those laws, those black codes. The only thing that carried over in the black codes was segregation. That stayed. But the black codes were one of the reasons why the U.S. Congress said, no, this Constitution is unacceptable, if you remember that. So the radical Republicans in the U.S. Congress required Texas to rewrite the Constitution and take the ironclad oath. All right, so overcoming the 14th Amendment, if you remember, what are those two clauses in the 14th Amendment that are important to this? Or that I put on the other slide anyway? Due process and equal protection of the laws. So so the 14th Amendment, people who were formerly enslaved should have equal protection of the laws. And if you recall, the privileges and immunities of U.S. citizens applied to citizens of the state as well. Remember us talking about that? Okay, that was the 14th Amendment. Well, they got around that with Jim Crow segregation. Right? Equal protection of the laws doesn't comport with segregation. That's not equal. So Jim Crow segregation was in place. It was declared constitutional. Plessy v. Ferguson, if you recall, 1896 Supreme Court case that upheld the constitutionality of that. Now, the Jim Crow law, when Jim Crow segregation was in place, it became a state law in 1891, which is just 5 years before that case. And what they did in 1891 here in Texas is they segregated trains. So African Americans could not sit in the same cars as white Americans. We did it here in Texas, and they did it in Louisiana, which you may know was the source of the case Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy, 1/8 black, sat in the first class white section of the train to force a decision on that. Okay. So the 15th Amendment, what does that say? What's the 15th Amendment about? Right, male suffrage, very good. So, male suffrage. Males should not be denied the right to vote. Well, ways that Texas got around that were through poll tax. So poll tax had been in state constitution before, but it was again passed, it was added in 1901 or thereabouts to our 1876 Constitution. So early 1900s, poll tax was imposed. And y'all answered a question about that in your reading quiz. Yeah. So the poll tax, many of us were still farmers here in our state. It was an ag state. And they were making us pay a poll tax in order to register to vote in January. January, I don't know, I'm not a farmer, but maybe some of y'all know. Are you buying seed and getting your land ready and prepared to plant? I mean, for some reason, January was a really bad month to ask people to pay some extra money to register. So that kept poor people, and a lot of us were poor, we're just farmers, subsistence farmers here. So that really affected who could register to vote. And of course, formerly enslaved people also weren't wealthy, and so that affected them as well. Then 2 years after that, state legislature passed a law that said only white people could participate in primary elections. We were a Democrat-dominated state back then, and so when is the candidate decided, really, who's going to win the election? The Democrats are more likely going to win. Where do we have a choice? Those primaries, right? So if you can't vote in the primaries, what kind of decision? Sometimes you have some decisions, yeah. There may be a race in the general election. But having white primaries really took suffrage out of the hands, really detracted from people's right to make that choice. And then your book talks about the violence and intimidation that was used. Roads were blocked. People couldn't get to the polls. Polls would be moved at the last minute. So that was another way to disenfranchise blacks and Hispanics. All right, so federal expansion of suffrage. So, we're going to also expand the vote to women. So the 19th Amendment, the right to vote shall not be disparaged on the basis of sex. And as I mentioned, women were voting in Texas primaries 2 years before that. So they were voting in those white primaries, which kind of think, I wonder if that helps some candidates win. I wonder if that's why they changed the law early. Don't know. 1924, the Supreme Court of the United States overturned the white primary state law. Okay, states, you cannot make that law. Unconstitutional. So then the Texas Democratic Party decided, okay, well, it's not a state law, but the Democratic Party is going to run white primaries. So they kept on running them after 1924. So 20 years later, Supreme Court again visits this Smith v. Allwright. The Supreme Court says white primaries are prohibited. So, okay, white primaries are prohibited. Fort Bend County decides, okay, for our Democratic Party here in our county, we're going to create Jaybird pre-primaries. So it's not going to be a white primary, but it's before the primary, we're going to have the candidates get together and have a pre-primary where people can select who they want to run. So that just one person will run in the primary.
So it was a way of getting around the Supreme Court and having white people select who was going to vote. Finally, the Supreme Court struck down that Jaybird pre-primary in 1953, but notice it took several decades to get that white primary removed from the state. All right, in 1964, with our 24th Amendment, poll taxes were prohibited at the federal level. So you can't impose a poll tax to vote for president or U.S. Senator, member of Congress, but they were still imposing a poll tax for state candidates. And that was then overturned in 1966 when the federal court decision from the Supreme Court prohibited the poll tax at state level. So in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. It was renewed in 1975 and several times since. But we're going to talk about renewal in 75 in just a minute. In 1971, what war was going on? Vietnam. So 18-year-olds were being drafted to go fight in Vietnam. But our voting age was 21. 18-year-olds could go get a beer before they left for Vietnam. They could not vote. So in 1971, the 26th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution that lowered the voting age to 18. So those who were fighting in our military, one reason to vote.
I'm sorry, what was the renewal in what now?
1975.
It's like I read it down, but I didn't
Thank you.
think about it.
Okay, so looking at these a little bit closer, that one. So the Voting Rights Act in 1965 prohibits racial discrimination in voting laws. Y'all may remember the early 60s with the the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Desegregation of schools with Brown v. Board in 1954. So it's this in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement. And voting rights is really being pushed by young people riding buses down into the South to try to help African Americans get registered to vote. And they were facing some pushback from the Southerners, particularly in Alabama, near Selma, where they were beating them up as they got off the bus at a rest stop and burning their buses so they couldn't get around and help people get registered to vote. So those things that were going on, the media was paying attention to and broadcasting it across the country. So there's a lot of building support to have some kind of federal legislation to protect people's right to get registered and vote, according to state law. But yeah, so that passed in 65, the Voting Rights Act. That was the 1975 renewal again, and this is where we fell under the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act applied to everybody, but there's next slide will talk more specifically about it. But in the 1975 renewal of the Voting Rights Act, they required bilingual ballots at the polls if the population where you were living had over 5% of people who spoke a different language at home. Their first language was something other than English. And so you can imagine, we have Spanish-speaking households that couldn't read a ballot because they spoke Spanish. So this was a requirement. If your county has more than 5% another language, then they need to have that ballot. Now this was 1975. This was after the Vietnam War ended, and we had a lot of Vietnamese coming and living here in Texas. And then that was another reason. It's when the counties were getting a lot of Vietnamese speakers who weren't able to vote. So that was another consideration. I'm going to 1993, the motor voter law that we talked about, that states are required to offer voter registration at the driver's license or public assistance applications. And after the 2000 election, with the hanging chads in Florida, if you remember, Florida was still conducting their elections old school way with these punch cards, and people had a stylus to punch through the card, and sometimes they didn't punch it enough. And so there's a question, who did they vote for? And this was what was stalling the election of 2000, right? Because Florida was the state that was going to determine who our next president was going to be. They had enough electoral college votes
whoever won the state was gonna be president. And so there were some counties that were being contested about, okay, who do they vote for? Because the vote was so close, so they're having to go back and recount the ballots hand by hand. And they were getting those ballots that had the hanging chads. It's like, okay, does that mean they voted for this person? Is a dimple? Is that, is that a vote? Or is that somebody deciding to go vote for somebody else?
When people are physically like counting like physical votes, who are those people?
Election workers. And so, yeah, and so they get people, I'm not sure how they do that. It's people I don't know, and there's a process. But, here we have an absentee board who looks at mail-in ballots coming in, and they make sure the signatures on the application match the signatures on the ballot. And there's people in these communities who are willing to give their time and effort to make sure it's done right. I think it's just amazing, so important to have civic engagement and people willing to give their time to help us out. So that was going on. So after the election of 2000 and just that debacle, they said, okay, the federal government stepped in again and said, you have to have electronic voting. Those of y'all who voted, I assume you go to the polls, it's electronic, right? That's the federal government required that. They gave us some money, not enough, but still, it was a mandate. So we have electronic voting, which standardizes elections across the United States. Although some states don't have a paper trail. So we have a paper trail. You get a paper ballot, right? You get it punched through your machine, and then you put it into the counting machine. So in case something goes wrong with the machine that's counting the ballots, we've got a paper trail. We need to count them. We've got them. Some states don't have paper. So that's one thing I think appreciate about Texas. They have that. So that was 2002. So we're going to go back and look at 1960. With this, and we'll go to 1965. This is just kind of an overview of what was going on. This is when the poll tax was implemented. So the blue line is the percent of voting age population that voted. The green line is the percent of voting age population that registered. So the percent that voted after the poll tax started, you can see dropped precipitously. People, about 50% fewer people were registering and then voting because of that. And then the registration totals. This here is when the 19th Amendment was ratified, so you can see that registrations jumped up. Women were getting registered to vote. And then the voting percentages increased somewhat. This is Smith v. Allwright. When, no more white primaries, and a little bit of effect, that actually went down for people voting. This is poll tax removed. This is 26-year-olds are voting. So you can see went up a little bit after 26th Amendment when 18-year-olds could vote. So registration went up. And then this is the motor voter law. So you can see registrations jumped up a lot after that. The blue line, the percent who voted, it's getting higher and higher, and then 2020, good turnout. All right, so going back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, Section 4 of that act, includes a formula to identify states with a history of racial discrimination. You look at how many people are registered across various demographic groups. You see if it had a history of discrimination of groups, keeping them from getting registered. If they have that history, then they fall under pre-clearance requirements. So the formula was in Section 4, and then Section 5 was pre-clearance. So Section 4 is the formula they created, and they found 16 states that met the bar for this history of discrimination. Consequently, pre-clearance requirements applied to those states and a few odd counties in different states. So any changes to voting laws or election districts had to be reviewed by federal authorities, by the Department of Justice, or the U.S. Attorney General had to sign off on those election law changes. Federal government oversight of elections. So we fell under pre-clearance in 1975 when that formula applied to us. So since 1975, the federal government was watching over our election laws. Now, in 2013, the United States Supreme Court heard a case, Shelby County v. Holder. Shelby County argued that Section 4, that formula was out of date because that was written in 1965 and our country had changed so much in 35 years or so since that was written. So we needed a new formula to figure out if people were being discriminated against for voter registration. So they overturned the Section 5 requirements because the formula did not apply anymore. So Texas was no longer under pre-clearance requirements. We didn't have to get approval of our voting and election law changes, our redistricting maps. They don't automatically go up to the federal government. And so after Shelby County v. Holder, this is when Texas closes about 403 polling places across the state. There were several states that did this after pre-clearance was lifted. 5 Texas counties, Fisher, Medina, Aransas, Coke, and Irion, rank among the top 10 nationwide for closing the greatest percentage of their polling places. So 5 out of 10 are here in Texas for closing these polls across, and those counties that I mentioned, are y'all familiar with them? One of the rural, small. Okay, but I also want to say moves forward with voter ID law. Right. So this is 2013. In 2011, Texas had enacted the voter ID law. SB 14 that required certain photo identification in order to vote. They were immediately challenged because remember we're still under pre-clearance. Before 2013, pre-clearance applied, so the federal court blocked the law, the voter ID law. Okay. In 2012, who was president of the United States?
Barack Obama.
Obama, very good. So it was his Department of Justice that was enacting that block. Okay, 2013, after Shelby v. Holder, Texas acts to implement the law, but is stopped by a lawsuit initiated by the Department of Justice. So we tried after pre-clearance was lifted and then got blocked by a lawsuit initiated by Obama's Department of Justice. Okay, so 2017, Texas legislature revises the ID requirements, SB 5, which we're going to look at in just a minute, and the Department of Justice drops that lawsuit. Now, who's president in 2017? Trump. Yeah. So they dropped the lawsuit. They didn't have to anymore because it was his Department of Justice. And then 2018, the revised law, SB 5, was upheld by the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals for the federal government. So that's what we use. I wanted to show you side by side those two voter ID laws. This was the first one passed in 2011. So in order to vote, you had to have a photo ID, your driver's license, U.S. military ID card worked, citizenship certificate with photograph, U.S. passport, license to carry a concealed handgun, or an ID card with photo approved by the state of Texas.
Did you have to have just one of these or all of them?
No, just one.
Oh.
Yeah, yeah. So it's, sorry.
Can you imagine having that?
Yeah. That would be a challenge. That would really be a challenge, yes. Military ID card, the second one?
No.
Oh, sorry, second one, sorry. Passport. Okay, but you had to have those in order to vote, and so that was blocked by pre-clearance and then by the Department of Justice. Those, now, for reasons maybe it's discussed with my mom, and she had to go get that ID card, maybe. And some people were arguing it's Jim Crow and Dixie. That's what they call it.
What's the second
SB
blank
14.
in the red?
Passport?
Oh, then what's the first blank?
Military ID.
Oh, okay. I had those faults.
So, okay, can't vote if you don't have this form of ID. 2017, the Texas State Legislature decides, all right, it's not Jim Crow and tuxedo. We're gonna make exceptions. So they still accept any of these. So when you go to vote, if you have one of those, you're good. If a reasonable impediment exists to your getting those forms of ID, then you can sign a declaration and present so your voter registration certificate that you get in the mail after you register, birth certificate, or a current utility bill, or a bank statement with your voter's name and address on it. You can give them that. But you're also signing an affidavit, which could give you a fine or prison time if you're lying. So you have to do that. But they wanted to make it so people could vote if they didn't have those forms of photo ID. So there is that. Okay. We're going to stop there for today, and I'll see you.